Good evening, everybody. Welcome to BrisScience. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Joel Gilmore. I'm your MC for this evening. And BrisScience is a series of free public lectures on science brought to you by the University of Queensland, where we aim to bring not just the best speakers, but also the best communicators to share, best scientists and communicators. They're scientists, anyway, to share their work and their passion with the communities of Brisbane and everybody watching on YouTube at home. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight and pay my respects to elders past and present. And it's a great time as we think about tonight some of the native species of Australia to remember the First Nations people of Australia have an incredible depth and history of knowledge stretching back over 60,000 years as one of the oldest living cultures in the world. And we hope that we can learn and understand that culture as we go forward. We will talk about our speaker soon. A couple of bits of housekeeping. First of all, if this is your first BrisScience, thank you so much for coming. We're going to have a talk followed by some Q&A, and then we would love for you to stick around for some food and drink afterwards and have a chat about everything that we've discussed tonight. We are going to take questions this evening through an app. So if you've got your phone, now is a great time to scan this. Look at that, so good. This QR code, and that will take you to a question page. You can put your questions in through the talk. It'll be up again afterwards as well. Put as many questions as you like, and we will go through as many as we can after our speaker. But please, while you've got your phone out, pop it on to silent. We don't need to phone any friends during this talk. Okay, so tonight we are going to be talking about some of the most terrifying animals in Australia. Obviously talking about birds. And given they're descended from dinosaurs, this should make a lot of sense. More specifically, we're talking about noisy miners and the threat they pose, yes, the terrifying noisy miners, to woodland bird communities and what we might be able to do to help. Our speaker tonight is the incredible Professor Martine Maron. Martine is a Professor of Environmental Management at the University of Queensland with a particular interest in the ecology of bird communities and conservation policies. She holds many other positions, including Director at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. But tonight, she is here to talk to us about the despots of the bird world. She is definitely not winging it. Please, thank you. Please welcome Professor Martine Maron.
Thanks so much, Joel. Well, I am winging it a little bit. We'll see how we go. I am so excited to see so many people here. Apparently it's a sellout and there's heaps of people online too. And the reason I'm so excited about that is because that means that everybody loves birds. I think that's a very scientific proof of the fundamental truth that birds are best. In fact, I was hearing just before that apparently talks about birds are right up there with, for some reason, talks about quantum mechanics as the most popular talks that are given in this series. So I think that's great. And it's really important too, because if you're in this room, if you're watching online, I hope that means that you are interested in birds, maybe even like birds, hopefully don't find them terrifying, despite them being technically dinosaurs. Keen to maybe see them thrive and hopefully avoid the extinctions that we are right on the precipice of if we don't act. So I want to talk a bit, particularly about the woodland birds of Eastern Australia and the things that we've done to make things really difficult for them and the things that we might be able to do to put things right. And before I start, I want to, and this will probably give me a good gauge about who's in the room, I want to ask about this species here. So this is a species that should be as famous as the thylacine. It's famous as the Tassie tiger. Who knows its name? One person? Anyone else? A couple of people? Okay, but presumably everyone's heard of the thylacine, right? This is the paradise parrot. This is a bird that used to live less than 200 kilometres from where we are right now. But, not only does not many people in the room know its name anymore, nobody in this room has ever seen it. In fact, nobody alive has ever seen it because it was last seen 98 years ago in central Queensland. This bird is extinct, this beautiful parrot. I mean, I think that's a terrible tragedy. And so what went wrong? How did we lose this bird? Well, we'll probably never completely know the answer, but it's certainly a few things that we know contributed. So one of those things is, this is lots of parrots eat grass seeds. So this is one of the grass seed eating parrots. And once we brought in grazers, livestock, to eat all the native grasses, then there was much less food for this bird. The habitat changed, the fire regimes changed, and so there wasn't as much for them to eat. And one of the really weird threats, in fact, a threat that I'm not aware that any other species faces, was in fact tennis. Because this is a bird you might know, you might have heard of a couple of its congeners, the golden-shouldered parrot and the hooded parrot. They're still alive today. They look very different, but they and this guy here all nested in the same way, which is by burrowing holes into termite mounds and nesting in there. Fantastic, safe places to nest. But termite mounds were actually coveted for their use in tennis court bases. So, you know, it's remarkable the many ways in which we altered the environment. Tennis wasn't one I would have picked, but there we go. So it's very, very sad, but the good thing is, like, if there's a tiny ray of light around this really, really tragic story, and I hope we're all feeling like this is what extinction feels like. It wasn't long ago. I mean, when I was growing up, there would have been people still alive who'd seen this bird. It's really not long ago. But it is actually the only mainland bird species to have gone extinct in Australia. And if you contrast that with the more than 30 mammals that we've sent extinct, you know, it's actually quite a contrast. I should say there probably are a couple of other birds that may well be extinct now on the mainland, but the only one officially declared extinct is the paradise parrot. So those 34 odd mammals that we've lost across Australia, they were really important parts of the ecosystems they lived in. They did all the jobs of turning over the soil, dispersing the symbiotic fungi. They were top predators. They had really important jobs to do. And because they're completely extinct forever, we can never get those functions back in the woodlands they used to help keep healthy. But almost all of our birds still exist, even if they are very threatened and have declined. So it is not too late for us to change that picture and to avoid any further extinctions and to bring our woodland birds back to these woodlands that they are such an inextricable part of. The second part of the message, though, is that there are so many other species that are facing the same fate as the paradise parrot. So if we're going to sort this out, we have to act, and we have to act soon. Who knows the name of this bird? A few more. And maybe, has anyone seen one? It's, well, lucky you, right? This is an amazing bird called the Regent honeyeater. Another incredible native bird. Unfortunately, it's one of 200 distinct bird taxa that are listed as nationally threatened in Australia. It's in fact critically endangered. This bird used to be a really common bird in the woodlands of eastern Australia, but now we're sort of looking at maybe a population of about 300 individuals left right across eastern Australia. So that is a very, very, very small population, and that is why it is so incredibly imperiled. And the reason for this is because, so it's a honeyeater, it does indeed drink nectar, it loves eucalypt blossom, but the thing is that even though you might like fly from Brisbane to Melbourne and you can look out and you can see there are lots of eucalypt trees there, you'll notice that they're all on the hills and on the less fertile country. All that really good stuff on the flats, we wanted that too. We cleared it so we could grow our crops there. We wanted agriculture in those places. And so the specific types of trees that lived on those flats, this guy needs, because they move around looking for nectar. We all know that there's no one place that has nectar all the time, right? We have to go from place to place if we need a feed of nectar every day. But a lot of those places that produce nectar at certain times of the year are now gone. And so there's just not enough habitat out there to support a healthy population of these species. So this sort of lifestyle of being able to nomadically move through the landscape from food resource to food resource is one of the reasons why this bird is threatened. And really the only reason that it is still alive today is because there's an incredibly dedicated recovery team that's doing a lot of work to manage its habitat, and also they run a captive breeding program and actually do releases into the wild. It's an incredibly intensive situation. But the sad thing is that's just one of the species on the threatened list. There are more and more being added all the time. And these 4 are woodland birds that were added just in the last couple of years to our national threatened species list. And I got to know these birds when I was doing my PhD about 25 years ago in Western Victoria in the Wimmera Plains. And I don't know if anyone knows that landscape, but it's a really, really very heavily cleared landscape. Not much woodland left there. But in the little patches that did remain, that's where I was studying birds. And some of them were lucky enough to still have these fantastic birds, the diamond firetail, the hooded robin, the brown tree creeper, and the southern whiteface. Absolutely stunning little birds. They're all ground foraging insectivores and granivores in the case of the finch, but they forage in different ways. Now, the really frustrating thing for me thinking back is that, first of all, I can't believe that was 25 years ago, but even back then, we knew these guys were in trouble. We knew they were declining. They'd already been reported as declining. 25 years later, now they're on the threatened species list. Now they're all threatening to be, lining up with the paradise parrot as the species that our generation might lose. And this pattern of species after species, particularly these woodland and forest-dependent species being added to the threatened species list, none of them coming back off. It's painting a really dire picture. And it's not just dire because, wow, how beautiful they are, and that would be a tragedy to think that you would never be able to see one of these again. That is very, very sad. But it is really a tragedy from the perspective of the health of the woodlands too, because these guys are inextricably woven into the fabric of the ecosystems. And when you lose them, things start to unravel. When you look at a woodland, you see the structure, you see the plants, and maybe you start to hear the birds, but if you were to describe it, you'd probably describe the structure that you see. But really, a woodland is made up of all the different functions that are going on. And a healthy bird community in a woodland should have things like pouncing robins. It should have small and large granivores wandering around on the ground. It should have things like babblers digging up invertebrates. It should have like fairy wrens and things jumping around in the bushes. Tree creepers and sitellas gleaning along the trunks of trees and the branches. Really important, it should have little insectivores that are gleaning insects off the leaves of the trees. It's a really important way that birds keep woodlands healthy, by taking pests away from the ecosystem. Large and small honey eaters and parrots, and birds that are doing the job of pollinating all of the different plants and the different types of flowers in the ecosystems. And things that are scavengers, things that are top predators, all of this is what we should be seeing in a healthy ecosystem. And so conserving this, even though we think about, and it's easy to tell stories about individual threatened species, you hear about the koala all the time, for example. Maybe the regent honeyeater isn't quite so famous, but really conservation is about preserving healthy ecosystems and allowing all of these species to continue to provide those services, keep those ecosystem processes ticking along, because it's ecosystems that support all the species, including us. So, why are we seeing this terrible syndrome of so many of these incredible woodland birds disappearing from more and more places? Well, the most obvious reason is, of course, we just don't have as much woodland anymore. So this is an image of all the green is basically the woodland and forest ecosystems in the temperate and subtropical zone of Australia prior to European colonisation. And this is what it looks like now. So obviously, we're in an incredibly depleted situation. There are just fewer places for all these woodland birds to live. So, it's not surprising that birds are not doing so well. But this map, it's a bit boring. It doesn't really show you the full picture. A better one is this one. and not just because it's colourful. In fact, it's sad that it's colourful, because I'll tell you what the colours mean in a second. But every one of those coloured pixels is a patch of bushland that's been cleared. So these are all the places where we used to have habitat for our woodland and forest birds, but we don't anymore. And you can see the different shades from blue to red. The redder it is, the more species of birds would once have lived there, that would have called that place home, and can't anymore because it's not there. And that's based on the distributions of those birds and their habitat preferences. And you can see that right here where we are tonight is in an absolute hotspot of species richness. So before this museum was here, before Brisbane was here, this would have been habitat for, maybe 180 different bird species. So when we destroy a hectare of habitat, we need to think not just about, well, was there a threatened species there or not? We've got to remember that full range of birds that are going to lose their home. And the really frustrating thing is that, of course, we're still doing it. It's not done. It's not something that we did in the past. Australia is infamous for land clearing because we're basically the only wealthy nation that is still clearing land at scale, and not just re-clearing of regrowing vegetation, which can be important to maintain agricultural productivity. We're still clearing old growth woodland and forest. This is a photograph that I took up near Darwin. You might have heard about the development at Lee Point for housing, and you don't really actually have to go that far anyway. You can go just to the edge of Brisbane. I live out west, and so I drive past a lot of the developments around Springfield, which are going into areas of bush like this. So it's occurring for housing developments, it's occurring right up and down the Great Dividing Range, increasingly for renewable energy, which we absolutely need, but which we must learn to put in more sensible places from a biodiversity perspective. It's occurring in forests, and it's still occurring in some agricultural lands across the state as well. So birds just have fewer places to live. And as I mentioned, it's really often concentrated in those most productive landscapes that we want to grow our food, but birds need to grow their food as well. So this is a classic example. This is actually a photograph of a little patch of Balar woodland out west of Toowoomba, but it could just as easily have been taken in the Wimmera landscape where I did my PhD. This was typical, less than 5% of native vegetation remaining. And these little patches become just so difficult for our birds to hang on in. There's limited space, there's limited resources, and they have to, if they're going to mix with the rest of the population, cross these really inhospitable matrices. So I did my PhD in landscapes like this, and I loved the birds that I could find there, but when I came to Queensland, which is 20 years ago now, I was actually quite excited, because even though a lot of Queensland has lost a lot of habitat, Queensland's a big place, and it's still got these great big areas of woodland and forest. If you go out a bit west, so Barracuda Forest, that's just sort of north of Chinchilla, stretching right along that bend of the Great Dividing Range out to the Carnarvons. So I was very excited, because I thought, now I can work in these fantastic, intact landscapes of woodland as far as the eye can see. This is going to be awesome for woodland birds. But they weren't. I was actually a bit shocked. And it's funny, because I have a colleague visiting from Western Australia, and he found the same thing today. He went out birding, and he's like, what's going on? You've got really big areas of woodland, but you don't have all these little birds. The important thing is not just to look at where the trees are. The really important thing for birds especially, yeah, they need the trees, but let's look at what's under the trees. So when I started working out in these landscapes, I saw a lot of degradation in the state forests, even in some of the national parks. I'm not just talking about on grazing properties. You had cattle grazing leases, you also had feral cattle, there were feral horses, and all of these things were removing that really important understory layer. The ground layer was disturbed and the shrub layer was grazed away. The other thing that was happening is that pasture grasses, introduced pasture grasses, were getting into areas of woodland and carrying fire into places that they might not otherwise get into, and that was also clearing out a lot of the understory. So we were ending up with this much more open structure. And so, you know, these phenomena, and you can imagine things like fire, likely to only get worse. What we're seeing with climate change, we know that we're going to see more and more severe fire weather days, more and more severe fires. And of course, we've lost the cultural burning practices that used to burn, you know, smaller, patchier, cooler burns, which help to actually protect big areas of the landscape from frequent fire. Now, all of these shifts are important for birds. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different parts of that structure that all those different birds in that ecosystem need for foraging, for nesting, for shelter. But actually, the biggest issue is that all of them are exacerbated by one thing, and this one thing is one of the biggest threats to woodland birds in Australia. And, you know, ironically, wow, that's big on the screen, isn't it? Gee, terrifying. I'd be terrified if I was a small bird. I'm sort of terrified anyway. So ironically, this threat is another native woodland bird, the noisy miner, the main event tonight. We are going to learn about this guy. Hopefully, this is a familiar face. Well, not hopefully, but I imagine that this is a familiar face. So I saw these wall to wall in those forests out west. You probably see them wall to wall in the streets of Brisbane, in your backyards, or wherever you live around here. Now, for those who haven't met these guys yet, lucky you, but also, and I shouldn't be mean, they are actually an amazing bird. They are, as I say, a native bird, and they're not to be confused with the introduced common miner, sometimes called the Indian miner. So you'll see this guy around as well. Now, this bird is actually a true miner, as in it's related to the starlings. The noisy miner is not a miner, just to be clear. One of the things that Europeans did when they came here and started putting common names to all our birds is they just named them after whatever sort of looked familiar compared to back home. So magpies aren't magpies, you know, fairy wrens aren't fairy wrens. So there's a lot of things in this category. And miners aren't miners, but we're stuck with the name for now at least. So it's a bit confusing though, because you actually have an introduced species, which is sort of, it gets a lot of bad press, and you know, it is a bit of a pest. But in terms of its influence on other birds in Australia, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just waiting for the rotten fruit to come flying at me. It's a bit of a controversial thing to say, but actually the one we should be worried about is the native one. So that's a bit of a weird story. I like to sort of point that out, that we have these really unique birds that aren't even related to the things that sort of looked like them and that are named after them, like our robins. They aren't robins. They're all these uniquely Australian things. And that's really important in this story because noisy miners are weird birds. And I think they're probably one of the most remarkable because, as I said, they're a native Australian honeyeater. Now, that's the same family as the poor regent honeyeater, which is having so much difficulty. They also occur right throughout the eastern woodlands, just like the regent honeyeater. But this species is sort of the opposite of a regent honeyeater in terms of all the ways that it responds to the changes that we've made in the landscape. It loves these changes, the clearing out of the understory, the fragmentation. And one of the reasons why it's able to do that, why it's able to enjoy these changes is, unlike the regent honeyeater, it doesn't rely on nectar. So it doesn't actually need to move around the landscape finding where the nectar is. So that means that what it's able to do is set up a territory and stay there and basically dominate it. But it does need sugar. And so it's an interesting one because how do you find sugar? If you're a noisy miner and you've got a territory of your own that you don't really go outside of, where are you going to find sugar year round? One of the main places is the cafe at UQ, and I imagine the cafe in all the streets of Brisbane because they're incredible little birds. They've actually worked out how to go down, grab a sugar packet out, hold it down, put their beak in, make a hole, and then drink the sugar out of the packets. Okay, that's obviously not the evolutionary basis for it, but luckily our actual woodlands have all these little sugar refineries scattered all through them, especially our eucalypt woodlands. And those are these psyllid insects. So they're little sap-sucking insects, that's hard to say, that they love especially eucalyptus leaves. And they, as I say, suck the sap, and they excrete from that the sugars, and they use that to make like a sugary case around them that sort of protects them and is sort of over the top of them on the leaves. And this is a really particularly serious sort of infestation. They're a native, there's many different species, they're a native insect. But they're such an important food source for our birds. So you can imagine, fantastic, this sugar, this is not seasonal, that's there all year round. And so lots of our woodland birds love this. Pardalotes and lots of honeyeaters and whistlers and things will go around prizing this sugar off. In fact, normally they'll eat it with the little protein snack and eat the insect that's underneath, which is how that helps to keep the woodlands healthy. But I'm not going to talk about them much tonight, but one of the relatives of the noisy miner, the bell miner, who you might also have met, so it's green, yellow bill, funny little orange bit by the eye, they've actually been recorded to basically farm these psyllid insects. So instead of just taking the whole insect and the sugar in one go, they just carefully prize off the sugary bit, leave the insect there so it can just keep producing sugar for them. And I don't really think we know if noisy miners do the same thing. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. But it's a good example of the most amazing way in which they've been able to adapt. The point is, there's sugar all the year round in a lot of our eucalypt woodlands, and that means that noisy miners stay there. They develop territories, they stay year round, and they basically defend their nectar resource. That's their life, is making sure that no one else comes in and eats these delicious little snacks. To do this, they move in gangs. So they have this most amazing social structure, which was actually first documented by Professor Douglas Dow, who was at the University of Queensland when he did this work back in the 70s. And it was done out in the Lockyer Valley, sadly in a patch of bushland that doesn't exist anymore. But he described the way these noisy miner societies operated. And so you end up with these incredibly large colonies of all these birds living together, and it might be hundreds and hundreds of birds, depending on how much habitat there is. But the important thing is that within that colony, you've got these little groups called coteries, and these groups, they might be a dozen or 24 birds, and they're your gangs, and they're basically cooperating to defend their piece of that colony's territory. And they fight like anything to do that. And they also cooperate. So one of the other cool things about Australian birds is that a lot of our birds work together as like a family or a group of mainly related but sometimes unrelated individuals to raise young. They'll all build a nest together. You might even have extra pair paternity of the young, but everybody's feeding the kids. It's not just the parents. And noisy miners do this too. They're cooperative breeders. So they cooperate to build nests, to defend the nest from nest predators, and to raise the brood, which all sounds very heartwarming. But actually, there is an awful lot of conflict in noisy miner society, because even though you get cooperation amongst members of a coterie, you get constant warfare at the borders of that coterie's territory. It's like a Shakespearean drama, heaps of fighting and argument between these adjacent families. They really love to fight their neighbours. They really love to scream about it while they're doing so. And this is what was going on in those big woodland areas that I was working in. This is why my colleague who went for a bird walk at Mount Cootha today didn't find many small woodland birds, but found a lot of noisy miners. They absolutely dominate when they're there, and it's noisy. They are, that part of their name, we should keep that one. If we change the miner, we should keep the noisy. But despite this sort of gangland war thing they've got going on, if a really serious threat turns up, like a raptor, a nest predator, or like a snake, and in fact, I actually saw this at my house yesterday, the noisy miners from all the different coteries will band together and chase it away. So when things get serious, they will muck in together. As I say, I watched this, I could see the noisy miners going hard at something up in the tree, and they were going, and I couldn't see it, and I eventually found there was a python curled around one of the branches up there, and they were just desperately trying to get this thing to wake up and go away. They went all day. Anyway, the problem is that it's not just potential predators and each other that noisy miners like to fight. they're absolute masters of territorial defence, so they have this really important sugar resource. They've got to manage that. If they lose that to others, then they won't be able to stay put, right? But the problem is they're really not very good strategists, and their approach to territorial defence is just chase everything. Just if it moves, chase it. And so because of this, I mean, and they're typical bullies, right? They pick on everything, but they really are the ones, they win against anything smaller than themselves. And that is most of our woodland birds. So when you're in a noisy minor territory, you will see almost no small woodland birds. Almost all the birds you'll see, and if you've got them in your garden, you probably think about it, you've probably mostly got the larger honeyeaters, the tough lorikeets and things like that, but you kookaburras, you know, they shrug them off. They still get bothered by these guys, but you probably don't have little scrub wrens and things like that. And so, absolutely fascinating. Here we have a native bird within its original range. They haven't moved out beyond the broad range they always probably occurred in, but really benefited by some of the changes we've made to the landscape, and I'll talk about those in a second. And a lot of people have worked on these guys, not just me, and they tend to call them rude names when they do. So they've been called things like overabundant, fair enough, hyper-aggressive, can't read it on that screen, bullies, despots, hence the title of tonight's talk, a reverse keystone. I quite like that moniker because it really gives a good indication that it's essentially a species that, unlike a keystone species, which is one that you need to be present for the ecosystem to function, this is one you need to be absent for the ecosystem to function. And they've also been called the enemy. So there is a lot of work on how these guys tick and the damage they do. I didn't know which graph to choose. Here's one with colourful lines on it. The main thing to take home from this is just to give you an idea. So each of the black splodges on the map of Australia is somewhere that I've collected some data on bird assemblages and noisy miners. And there's about 300 different survey sites. Each of the different coloured lines is the modelled effect of noisy miners on other birds in one of those splodges. You can see they're all basically following the same pattern, so I didn't bother labelling them all. On the y-axis, you can see that's the proportion of the birds that are small birds, small songbirds, the ones that are really sensitive to noisy miners. And you can see that if you've got no noisy miners in your site, chances are most of the birds you're recording are small birds. But as soon as you get just a few birds per hectare, that absolutely dives. And once you get like really very dense colonies, you've got almost no small birds left. That is an incredibly stark effect. And I should say, this is the case regardless of the effect of habitat quality. You know, there have been various ways statistically and experimentally to exclude the effects of habitat from this. It's basically, if you've got noisy miners, you're in trouble. And it's difficult for people like me who like to study the ecology of bird communities, because as soon as you've got noisy miners, they basically swamp every other statistical effect you could possibly detect in the ecosystem. So the really interesting thing is, though, that, you know, or I should say, these are some of the guys who lose out, by the way, but we've actually been able to identify over 80 species, all which are almost never present when you have noisy miners. So that's a really, really big problem. So while all of these small guys lose out, the interesting thing is that there are other birds that actually do quite well. As I said, they chase pretty much anybody. The bigger birds shrug them off, and they have good reason to chase a lot of those bigger birds, because things like kookaburras, currawongs and so on, they are nest predators. You know, they will eat baby noisy miners, so they have a good reason to be a bit worried about them. But with one particular nest predator, they actually like do a coalition deal. They're in cahoots. It's really weird, and this is them, the butcherbirds. So butcherbirds, you can see the hook on the bill. You can probably guess why they're called butcherbirds. So they are nest predators, but they also take, you know, skinks and frogs and, you know, small vertebrates, and they are known to sort of impale them and, well, butcher them with that hook. So vicious bird, and if anyone's ever held one in your hand, you know that hook is a serious weapon. This is exactly the sort of bird that noisy miners should be chasing away, and yet they don't. So I did an experiment on this, and I worked on them out in one of these western forests, and I wanted to work out who were the birds that the noisy miners were particularly chasing. Where were they really spending their energy? And it turns out that pretty much they were chasing everything in proportion to how common it was. So if it was there, they chased it, but not these guys. They almost never chase this. They would sit on the same branch together, happy as Larry. So why would they do that? It is pretty weird. One theory, partly backed up by some dodgy unpublished data, but I'm going to just air the theory anyway, is that the noisy miners like these guys as henchmen, because when a big predator turns up, like I said, that python from yesterday, or an owl, or some sort of a raptor, as I say, the noisy miners go mad and they mob. Now they've got numbers and they've got noise, and they will hassle these things, but what they don't have is weaponry. They are pretty cute, fluffy little birds, They can't actually do that much damage if you're a big thing like a raptor. But butcher birds, on the other hand, can. And so I've done experiments where I've presented, a mounted owl specimen to a colony of noisy miners and watched what happens. And when there are butcher birds present, the noisy miners see it first. They're very good at territorial surveillance. They'll start calling, they'll start mobbing, the butcher birds hear it, they come over, and while the noisy miners just sort of fly at the owl, the butcher birds attack, actually use their hook and do damage. And you can imagine that's going to be much more effective a way to expel a predator than just being annoying and fluttering a lot. So there's one theory. Anyway, the upshot is you can see all of these disruptions that are going on in ecosystems when you have these noisy miners. You remember that really diverse bird community of the healthy woodlands? Well, the bird community of a noisy miner-dominated woodland is very different. So, you get, most of the birds are noisy miners, and then you get a few larger-bodied birds that are resistant, and that's sort of it. And that's not really what most of our woodlands need. And you might also be wondering, okay, so but is the problem getting worse? Because as I said, they're not expanding their range. Well, yeah, it is. This is some work that was done by the Cornell University with eBird data, an analysis that shows the change in abundance of the different birds of the noisy miners over time over just an 8-year period. All of the blue are areas where they've increased, and you can see this zoomed in one around us. Those are huge increases, more than 30% in some parts just inland of here over just 8 years. So the noisy miner and its effect, it's now listed as a key threatening process nationally. So what can we do about this? The first thing is we need to stop making habitat that noisy miners love. If your lifestyle involves chasing other birds away constantly, then you want to be able to do it efficiently. And being able to see very clearly your whole territory without any pesky shrubs and bushes in the way is a really good way of doing that. It also means there's not many good places for anyone you are trying to chase away to go and hide and make the job difficult. So park-like lawns with eucalypts, not great. We need fewer of those. Noisy miners can, though, live in denser bushland. And I mentioned Springfield, so this is some of the bushland that's slated for clearing for housing out near Springfield. Obviously, if this is cleared for housing, then 150 odd birds will lose their homes. But even in what's left, what we're going to do is increase the amount of edge habitat compared to interior habitat. And if you're a noisy miner and you don't have nice open habitat, the next best thing is to at least be on the edge of some dense habitat, and that's how you can dominate there. So fragmentation, more edges, not good for our woodland birds. And I also mentioned the sugar thing. And a lot of us were told we should plant native gardens, and we definitely should. But one of the things that we love to put in our gardens are grevilleas and things that produce lots of nectar, because, good for the birds. And they are good for the birds, but they're really good for the big, aggressive, dominant birds like noisy miners. And so really, we should be choosing species that don't have either, prolific nectar or species that don't tend to support as much lerp, which I know seems counterintuitive because I've said, well, it's so good for birds, but that doesn't much matter if those birds can't access it because it's being dominated by noisy miners. So this is not a photo that's probably going to convince you to plant something other than a grevillea, because it's just an opportunistic one that I took from our place. We're inland west about an hour, and it was a horse paddock when we moved in. But we had to make a choice about what we were going to revegetate with. And we chose dry rainforest species. We're part of the rosewood scrub. And we had this wonderful choice, and like all of us do in Brisbane, have this choice to plant these incredible species that have softer leaves, shinier leaves, don't tend to get lerps, don't have as much nectar, fantastic for birds, and you can see the structure that we've created. So we no longer have noisy miners on that block. So it is possible. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with, though, is that the scale of this challenge, it's just huge, you know? When thinking about these wall-to-wall noisy miner colonies in hundreds of thousands of hectares of woodland, it's really, really challenging. So a lot of the solutions in these areas are going to be a bit different, and they might be things like managing grazing where we can, because noisy miners are actually one of the only, perhaps the only, honey eater that walks around on the ground. That's a weird thing for honey eaters to do. It thinks it's like a magpie or something, and they actually do a bit of ground foraging. So grazed areas are very suitable for noisy miners. If we can reduce grazing, sometimes we can do that. Managing fire, whatever we can do to develop that structural complexity back in as many parts of the landscape that we can, that's all going to be good. But we can't always do that. I mean, a lot of these areas are being managed for other values. And in some cases, we may not have time. So if regent honey eaters, for example, turn up in an area and start breeding, but they're being bombarded by noisy miners, we don't have time to grow an understory to try to help them out. You know, it may take a decade or more to improve things. So we need to really think of every possible option we have at our disposal to do something about it. And there is one last option that can help, but it's a bit controversial, and that is lethal control. And even back in the 1990s, there were experimental removals of noisy miners from site. I'm using removal in a, just to make it sound a bit gentle, but you can see basically what it involves. And this is why it's controversial, and it's understandable. But the results of those removals, so they were basically, it was removals that were done by Marilyn Gray and Mike Clark and Richard Loyne in central Victoria, small patches of woodland, noisy miners removed from some, not removed from others, so they had a control and treatment comparison. Fantastic. But the thing that was remarkable is that the small birds actually came back quite quickly without any changes to the habitat, even though they were sort of semi-degraded patches. The small birds would be there if it weren't for the noisy miners, which is what they discovered by removing the miners. But then years later, I think it was like 15 years later, I was talking to Marilyn Gray about that, and she said, yeah, I went back there, and the noisy miners still haven't come back. That's just weird, because that is not how problem animal control works. You know, if you're thinking about any other pest, you're going to have this really ongoing effort to maintain that effect, surely. But if noisy miners have this really strict sort of social structure and these really tight territories, maybe that actually means that we can do things that are effective for a long time, which might make them really quite a cost-effective way to rebird these landscapes. There have been a bunch of different removals since then, done in different contexts, and some of them worked and some of them haven't though. And so when you're talking about something that involves the death of a native animal, you really want to make sure you know what you're doing and you're doing it in the right situation. So Courtney Melton, who did her PhD with me, works for Bush Heritage now, she actually did a review, in fact reanalysed all the data she could find of noisy miner removals, even finding new examples by talking to landholders who perhaps took it upon themselves, having observed the behaviour of the miners, to implement unsanctioned culls. So she was able to access, you know, probably the biggest database of removals, and the idea was to try to work out what makes some of them work and some of them not work. Unfortunately, the answer was still not sure. It seemed really idiosyncratic, but the weird thing was that the ones that people reported as not working, they reported as not working because the noisy miners came back, which you think, yes, fair enough, that means that it didn't work. But even in those ones, the small woodland birds recovered. So that's really odd. That's not something you see in nature. You don't see noisy miners and small birds kicking around together. But these culls seem to do something. They disrupted what noisy miners were able to do to dominate a site. So oh, yeah, and if you want to know more about her work, there's a great conversation article that Courtney wrote about that. Whoops, but there we go. So I just wanted to give you a few stats to flesh that out. So this is one experiment that was done, and it's probably the biggest one done to date. 24 sites across New South Wales, 2 different regions. In each region, half the sites randomly allocated to have noisy miner treatments. The other half were the control sites. It was random, and this was work, I should say, that was led by Paul McDonald and Kim Morte, Richard Major, and Galen Davitt. And I was involved, but only in a very, very small way. These sites were woodland patches, 30 to 40 hectares. In total, the removal of noisy miners was across about 340 hectares. So it was a really large-scale removal. So what did we find? So this graph basically shows what happened on average at the control sites, where we didn't do any noisy miner removal, and the removal sites where we did the noisy miner removal. And what we were aiming to do was to get the noisy miner density below the threshold that they weren't defending it anymore, that they shouldn't be damaging, shouldn't be harming the other birds. That's actually a really low number, so it's less than 1 bird per hectare. So this is what we were aiming to do. This is the density of noisy miners per hectare before the cull. You can see very nicely, very, very similar between the control and the treatment. Fantastic. This was after the first cull, and this was after the third cull. So there were actually 3 culls just during this period of time here. And you can see that we would go, right, well, that failed. I couldn't believe it. We took out so many noisy miners, and within a few days, the place had just as many noisy miners as before they were removed. This landscape, these landscapes in New South Wales were so saturated with noisy miners that were probably floating around, didn't have their own territory, that they just sucked into this place real quickly. So we thought, okay, well, that's no good, because we're still, even though we're a bit low, the removal sites are still not significantly different from the sites where we did the removals. From the control sites, and they're still above the threshold. But we kept monitoring, and then this happened, and that was weird. So it was like there was a delayed effect. So straight after the removals, noisy miners flooded in, but it was like they just couldn't sort themselves out. They couldn't reorganise into a gang that was effective, and they started to float away again. They kept declining in number to the point where they were significantly fewer in those sites. So that was interesting too, but then the other thing is they still weren't below the threshold, and we thought they would have to be below that threshold for the small birds to thrive. So what were the small birds doing? So, same thing, during the cull, before we started, small birds, very, very similar richness at both control and removal sites, but afterwards, even though the noisy miners were still quite high density, the small birds were doing better, significantly better at the sites where we did the removals. And as we kept monitoring, that was maintained, and we ended up with more than twice as many small bird species at the removal sites, even though the noisy miners were sort of still persisting, but at a lower density. It's not quite what we expected. I think this basically shows that things are very, very complex, but there are situations where these culls of noisy miners can be really important conservation tools. We need to work out where and when. But back to our region honeyeater, this is a species that, as I've said, it's right on the brink, and it is absolutely one of the ones that is so susceptible to noisy miners. It gets beaten up badly because when there is a nectar resource, I've said they don't need nectar, but when there is nectar, they want that nectar, and they do not want any other birds to have it. So when the regent honeyeaters need it, and maybe they need it because they're trying to breed nearby, they get badly beaten up. But the recovery team has trialled, and particularly some work by Ross Crates and Dean Ingwersen and others, they've trialled targeted removals of noisy miners from around nesting areas, because, as I say, the regent honeyeater, it'll just show up somewhere, start nesting. You've got to swing into action to make sure that nesting attempt works. And removing the miners does. It improves the success rate, could be part of the secret to keeping this species with us and not letting it join the likes of the paradise parrot. So I hope you'll agree, that's a weird set of stories about Australian birds. Australia is such a unique place. Our birds are not like anywhere else on the planet. We have these hyper-nomadic birds, we have birds that are hepped up on sugar, we have birds that do coalition deals and work out in gangs, but we have intensely family-focused birds that only raise a family if there's, a crowd to help them do so. It also means that conservation of Australia's birds is, in some ways really simple, and in some ways it's really complex. So the simple part is we have got to stop destroying the places where they need to live. They need places to be. But we also need to recognise that that is only a necessary but not sufficient condition if we're to conserve our birds. We also need to make sure that those places are safe and suitable. So watch the birds around your place, see what they're doing, see who's in charge, see what you might be able to do to help them out. Join BirdLife Australia, join Birds Queensland, learn more about their plight and help us, do what we can to save our woodland birds. Thank you.
Wow, what a presentation. We're going to take some questions now, so we will pop up that QR code again. There's already a bunch that have gone in there, but if you would like to ask a question, throw it into that page now. We'll get to those in a moment. We, of course, do run a talk every month during the year, so we'll be back next month, and we have a fantastic speaker again. We have chemistry professor Jack Clegg, who is a multi-award-winning professor, and he is going to discuss his work on flexible crystals. They're so flexible you can tie them in a knot. So he's a fantastic speaker, although he's got a tough act to follow. So hop onto our website, sign up to the mailing list so you get notified when those tickets become available. All right, questions. Are you ready?
I'm nervous, yes.
Okay, there are quite a few. So first question I'm going to is from Kenneth, who asks, are there any natural predators of the noisy miner? Might there be ways to encourage habitat that favours these predators?
Yes, absolutely. And all the things that depredate on other birds would absolutely snack on a noisy miner if they could. Raptors, pythons, all of these things will absolutely go a noisy miner. But that's the thing, they are so effective at chasing them away. They've got all these eyes, so they detect the predator before it can detect them. They hassle it until it eventually gives up and nicks off. So they seem to be quite effective at avoiding the levels of predation, especially nest predation that a lot of birds face. Lots of native birds like to eat other birds' eggs and nestlings and things. But their lifestyle just makes them pretty resistant to that sort of thing, and that's why I guess they're so successful and they've been able to increase so much.
Great. All right, we've got a couple of questions, and apologies if I can't remember everybody who asked this, but Jen and others have asked, what are the types of native plants that we should be planting to encourage smaller birds in our garden?
Yes.
You mentioned your garden, but...
Yeah, and I mean, look, I have grevilleas in my garden, but only a few, and I'm lucky because we're on a bit of acreage out west, and so we've got a bit of space. So immediately around the garden, yeah, I've got some pretty nectar-bearing things, but beyond that, I try not to plant anything that is a really big nectar-providing thing. Luckily, if you look at the native plants to this local area, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of amazing local species you can get at local native nurseries that are more like sort of rainforest style plants. So they have beautiful foliage and they still have beautiful flowers and they can still have a bit of nectar, but they don't tend to have the psyllids that hang out on the leaves and make all that sugar. The other thing though, if you're in more of a sclerophyll type woodland area, prickly things, dense shrubs, anything that gives a little bird somewhere to get away and hide from noisy miners. The more structural complexity, the better. So it's more about, the structure and the lack of sugar that you're looking out for.
Amazing. We probably should clear this one up because Quentin Rowan and Anonymous all want to know, so can we kill noisy miners? And maybe the follow-up question, Michael asks, if I see noisy miners bullying small birds in my garden, is there anything I can do?
Right.
Short of
killing. A hotline. I mean, we can, but no, you shouldn't. So it's really interesting though, because a lot of people who live on properties have observed this behaviour and they lament the loss of the small birds from around their homesteads, and they sort of take matters into their own hands. Every state and territory has a different legal framework that governs whether or not you can destroy noisy miners as a management approach. You will need a permit. It's very difficult to do in urban areas because you probably shouldn't be, firing shotguns in your suburban streets. So it's a very difficult thing. Really what we're talking about in a suburban setting, and if you're seeing that bullying going on, have a bit of a look at the context. So it may be that there's actually not much you can do, because if you've got a small block that you have control over and all your neighbours maybe have some tall eucalypts and some grevilleas and nice lawn, or you're next to a park that's like that, it might be really hard for you to manipulate things on your block. But if you are next to a park like that, you can talk to your local council. You can talk about whether you can actually plant some more noisy miner unfriendly, small bird friendly things, try to change the structure and move away from that parkland and trees type structure. And in your own garden, as I say, do whatever you can to get that structure and density there. But if you're surrounded by unsympathetic neighbours, it might be hard, but maybe you can talk them around and you can all band together and create some small bird habitat.
Amazing. Leaving noisy miners behind just for a moment, we have a couple of questions from Nicole and others who are talking about issues like climate change and phenomena such as droughts and floods and those broader impacts on bird populations. Is there anything you can say about?
I mean, that's the thing. We've zeroed in on one thing, and it's a big thing. But of course, there's this huge range of different threats that many of our birds face. And the part of the thing that makes noisy miners such a difficult issue is that many of those things suit noisy miners really well. So if you think about climate change and increased droughts tend to thin out the density of forests and woodlands. Now, one of the really interesting things that's been observed, and this was observed during the Millennium Drought in Victoria, is that places that had nice dense habitat structure, lots of small birds, in the drought thinned out, noisy miners were able to move in. Now this is suitable habitat for them. They take over, the drought breaks, the shrubs grow back, but the noisy miners, they've already got the upper hand. So it's like, once they're in, they're really hard to get out again. So there's this ratchet effect that's linked to climate change. There are so many different threats to our birds from climate change, and being here in Queensland, one of the really important groups that's going to suffer are those endemics that only live at high elevations in the wet tropics, because they're going to have nowhere to go as the climate changes. And there's so many things to lament, which is why we need to organise and all help them out.
Which, and Andy's got a question here. I won't ask all of it, but he sort of notes that at the start of your talk, or that you said there's still hope. How do you remain positive, and what are the things that you see as changing in a positive direction that you're hopeful for?
Well, I mean, the fact this room is full of people to hear about birds, I mean, it really is. I've been involved with BirdLife Australia, with other organisations. You mentioned the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. Since COVID in particular, I think more and more people are aware of this problem. So, and that's what we need, really, because at the moment we have, am I allowed to say political things? I was just going to point out the rather
What's the worst that could happen?
Pitiful investment in environmental protection and management that most of our governments, we receive a few crumbs, tiny fraction, less than 0.1% of a federal budget goes to nature. We know that we could repair most of nature for, say, 1% of the federal budget, 0.3% of GDP. And we also know that half of our GDP depends moderately or strongly on nature and successful conservation, but we're not investing in it. The only way we're going to get to see that investment happen is if people actually care and start to expect that. Start not to accept this narrative that, it's all terribly expensive and we can't possibly. Very little is being done, and we're going to keep seeing this threatened species list get longer and longer unless it's taken seriously. Yeah.
That is a fantastic call to action. We're almost out of time, but I have 3 quick questions that people have asked that I want to write down. And I apologise, I can't remember who asked them, so I'm going to go with it. The first one was, you know who you are. Can we eat noisy miners?
Trying to remember. I have spoken to someone who has done. I mean, yes. Again, I suppose you probably need a permit. There's probably some food safety implications. I don't know, depending on how you've come across them. There's no reason why you couldn't.
Great. There'll be a great cooking talk next year to go through the... second question, if you were a bird, what bird would you be? These are the hard-hitting questions from the BrisScience audience.
Oh, God, if I was a bird, what bird? I've never been asked that question. What's your favourite bird? Well, what bird would I be? No, I can't...
Rihanna, that's who it was. Rihanna, you know who you are.
I'll go with rainbow beater, but that's just because it's my favourite bird. Actually, no, I can't do that. I'm from Melbourne. I only wear black. I'm not a rainbow beater. I don't know. Too hard. I'll think about it.
Great one. And then the big question is, if you were going to rename the noisy miner, what would it be?
It's so funny because I hadn't really thought about renaming it until just then. So I don't know. What would everyone else call it? It's got to be the noisy something. Good one. I like what I won't repeat.
Well, have you got some material to discuss over drinks and snacks tonight? Your favourite bird, what bird you'd be, and maybe steer away from the chicken burgers. Please, could you join me in thanking our incredible speaker tonight, Professor Martine Maron. We'll see you all next month.